Those who walk on water reside in the realm of mythology. What you are is a follower of Eusebius. It's in the Gospels.
A reading from a forged letter of the Roman Emperor Antoninus to the Common Assembly of Asia, supposedly written in 161 AD. The Emperor Caesar Titus Aelius Adrianus Antoninus Augustus Pius, Supreme Pontiff, in the 15th year of his tribuneship, consul for the third time, father of the fatherland, to the Common Assembly of Asia, greeting. I would have thought that the gods themselves would see to it that such offenders wouldn't escape, because if the gods had the power, they themselves would much rather punish those who refuse to worship them, but it's you who bring trouble on these people, and accuse as the opinion of atheists that which they hold, and lay to their charge certain other things that we're unable to prove. But it's advantageous to them if they should be thought to die for what they're being accused of, and they conquer you by being lavish of their lives instead of yielding the obedience that you require of them. And regarding the earthquakes which have already happened and are now occurring, it isn't seemly that you remind us of them, losing heart whenever they occur, and setting your conduct in contrast with that of these men, because they have much greater confidence toward God than you yourselves have. And indeed, you seem at such times to ignore the gods, and you neglect the temples, and make no recognition of the worship of God. And so, you're jealous of those who do serve him, and persecute them to the death. Concerning these people, some of the governors of the provinces wrote to my most divine father, to whom he replied that they shouldn't at all disturb these people unless they were found to be attempting anything against the Roman government. And to me also many have sent intimations regarding these people, to whom I also replied in pursuance of my father's judgment. But if anyone has a matter to bring against anyone of this class, merely as such a person, let the accused be acquitted of the charge, even if he's found to be one, but let the accuser be amenable to justice. That was a reading from a letter of the Emperor Antoninus that was forged by Christians in the late 2nd century. And this letter was added to the manuscripts of Justin Martyr sometime in the late 100s. Someone added it right after the letter of Hadrian to Fundanus, the one from the opening reading in our last episode. So that now in the Justin text, you can read the Hadrian letter after he finishes his main remarks, and then it moves right on to this Antoninus letter. Okay, some questions for the forger of this. First of all, why is the Roman emperor implying that the Roman gods are not powerful? Why does the Roman emperor appear to be acknowledging the Christian God? Why does the Roman emperor appear to be implying that the pagan Romans should be worshiping the Christian God? Why does the Roman emperor seem to be desperately circumlocuting to avoid saying the term Christian? Why does the Roman emperor merely note in passing that local governors have been persecuting Christians to the death, which is illegal according to him, but he just kind of blandly reminds them that, hey, they probably shouldn't be doing that? Why is the Roman emperor saying that if someone is accused of being a Christian, that the accuser should be punished and not the actual Christian? But most importantly, why is the Roman emperor totally ignoring Pliny's letter and Trajan's response? He's saying here that no one can be brought up on charges merely for being a Christian. That's what he means when he says, let the accused be acquitted of the charge, even if he's found to be one. To be one means to be a Christian. Whereas Pliny's letter said the exact opposite. And consider that this Antoninus letter was forged probably in the 170s, would be my best guess, late 160s, around the same time as Hadrian's letter from last time. Was anyone at that time aware of Pliny's letter about Christians? I mean, here I thought that Pliny's epistulae had been published and had been circulating throughout the empire by that time. Do any of these Christian forgers of the late 2nd century know about it? I mean, Tertullian around the year 200 supposedly knows about it, but none of these guys before him seem to. I mean, what's going on? I've just gone over the reasons why this is commonly considered to be a forgery, and even theologians, for a change, also agree on that. It was forged by some zealous Christian who wanted something over the name of a Roman emperor that ended the persecution of Christians. And as you can see, because the letter refers to it, this forger was also aware of the equally forged letter of Hadrian to Fundanus. Christians in the 2nd century pencil-whipped a number of imperial rescripts having to do with persecution. And if you weren't convinced that the reading from last time, Hadrian's letter to Fundanus, that was a forgery, it really should be clear to you now that this kind of thing was going on at the time. And that's why I structured it this way, where we covered the Hadrian letter in the last reading, the Antoninus letter in this one. It's kind of like a double tap. Now, this forger was not of the same school of thought as the one who came up with the Pliny letter. I think that the forger of Pliny's letter was much more sophisticated and much more studied in Christian tropes than this boob. This forger here was more of the Justin Martyr school of thought that said Christians aren't doing anything wrong, so I'm confident that if the Romans just cease to consider Christianity a crime and, investigate us only of the secondary crimes that we're actually accused of, if any, then you'll certainly find us innocent. I mean, Christians are good people in the forger's mind here, and in Justin's mind. And the forger of Hadrian's letter was also of this same school of thought. Since in their mind, Christians don't actually commit these monstrous crimes like incest or infanticide, so if the Romans investigate whether they've actually committed those monstrous crimes, they'll find that they don't, and hence, by their logic, there's no reason for Christians to even be in court to begin with. Do you get that? That's Justin Martyr's solution. That's the solution of the forger of the letter of Hadrian and this letter of Antoninus, which for all we fucking know could have been Justin Martyr himself in both cases. But the forger of Pliny's letter disagrees with that philosophy. He's more aligned with Tertullian's school of thought. And I gotta tell you, in my mind, just as an aside, there's like 6-1 odds on Tertullian actually being the forger of the Pliny letter, as has been suggested by some in the past. But the forger of the Pliny letter is more of Tertullian's ilk, like I said, where he's thinking that the Romans are just going to accuse us of the monstrous crimes anyway. He recognizes that the monstrous crimes are just an excuse. He's more cynical than Justin. So in the mind of the forger of Pliny's letter, it's better to have the Roman emperor say not what Hadrian was made to say, not what Antoninus was made to say, which was that the Romans ought to investigate the monstrous crimes, but rather, if the Christians deny their faith, then the Romans can't consider them liable for the monstrous crimes. Would make no sense to a Roman, but to a Christian, this lets weaker members of the faith slip through the net. And like I've been saying, it limits exposure, because as it stands, the village mob and the local administrators do not draw a distinction in their minds between someone committing the monstrous crimes and someone professing Christianity. So when you combine this privilege of getting a complete pardon once you deny your faith with the other provision from Pliny's letter, which was that Christians can't be arrested or ratted out by anonymous informants, then you have successfully limited the persecution, assuming, by the way, that there was such persecution in the forger's time, which is far from clear. Like I said in episode 11, the Christian horror stories about persecution such as we read about in Justin Martyr may have been based on some garbled account of some incident that happened in some burg, and the 2nd century clerics found it useful to amplify that incident in order to advance their doctrines about Christianity necessarily being hated, Christians suffering in the manner of Jesus, Christians suffering on behalf of God, like the various Jewish martyrs did. Another benefit to the Pliny letter, and one which also brings it more in line with Tertullian's school of thought as opposed to Justin's, is that it almost glories in the idea that the Roman state is rejecting Christianity, whereas the letters of Hadrian and Antoninus make it look like the Roman emperor is the Christians' big brother sticking up for them, which is really not a good look, especially after Jesus just got done saying that you will be hated by everyone because of my name. But then with these forged letters, we now have to put a little asterisk next to that where it's like, yeah, you'll be hated by everyone, except for the deified pagan sovereign and ruler of the oikumene, who has the undisputed power of life and death over every man, woman, child, animal, and plant in the visible universe. In fact, he will end up being your greatest protector. He's going to love the shit out of you. In fact, he's going to constantly be telling local officials to knock it off when they come after you. So these Hadrian and Antoninus letters are therefore unsustainable in the Christian pathos economy of the late 2nd century, early 3rd century, because they depict the emperor as being a protector and advocate for Christians. And that's one of the reasons why they needed Pliny's letter, in which there's no love lost between the Romans and the Christians, but the structure of Pliny's letter also conforms more closely to their beloved tropes. And it also prescribes a form of light treatment and limits their exposure. And by the way, something I haven't mentioned yet, the early Christians who knew about Pliny's letter from Tertullian's citation of it, I covered that in episode 10, but all of those early Christians considered Pliny's letter, Trajan's response, as favorable to Christians. It's only in modern times where we're supposed to think of it as negative towards Christianity, because of course, that negativity towards Christians is brought out as one of the main arguments for its authenticity. But here's what brother of the show Eusebius says about Pliny's letter. And remember, he didn't have the actual letter. He got all his info about it secondhand. Nonetheless, here's how he received it. Quote, Trajan made the following decree, that the race of Christians shouldn't be sought after, but when found, should be punished. Because of this, the persecution, which had threatened to be a terrible one, was to a certain degree checked, but there were still many pretexts left for those who wished to do us harm. End quote. He's almost thankful for Trajan's response to Pliny. He says that without it, the persecution would have been much worse. And he says that that's because Trajan prohibited the Romans from tracking down and arresting Christians. So he and the forger of Pliny's letter are on the same wavelength. Modern theologians, on the other hand, find themselves needing to explain why Trajan would prohibit the state from apprehending Christians if Christianity was such a threat that even its mere profession is a crime. Now, it should be noted that the Roman Empire didn't have a police force aside from small garrisons in a few key cities. But what Trajan actually means in his response when he says that Christians shouldn't be sought out is basically leave them alone. If you have to try them in court at all, it should be in a case that's brought by an accuser who is himself assuming risk by bringing the case. And the early Christians like Eusebius recognized and appreciated that. Now, Tertullian said about Pliny's letter that it is at once merciful and cruel. So he also recognizes the benefit of it when he calls it merciful. He does also call it cruel, but as it turns out, this supposed cruelty of the Pliny letter also fits Tertullian's specific agenda. He was trying to highlight that the Christian faith was going to be rejected by the empire no matter what, and he found that Pliny's letter fit that theme rather well, which is not a surprise, being that it was forged by a Christian cleric shortly before him, and at the same time, he wanted to use it as kind of the origin story for the Roman legal proceedings against Christians. Now here's what the Christian writer Orosius from the 5th century says about Pliny's letter. Quote, Pliny the Younger, who had been appointed prosecutor with other judges, reported that the Christians were doing nothing contrary to the Roman laws apart from their profession of belief in Christ and their inoffensive meetings. Also, he said that none of them, sustained by their harmless belief, thought death a matter of grief or of dread. On receiving this information, the emperor at once modified his edict by rescripts couched in milder terms. End quote. So Orosius also sees Trajan as benefiting the Christians there, but more importantly, I ask you to really consider the wording of Orosius there and how he described Pliny's letter and what it contained. Please rewind and listen to it again if needed. And listen to how he describes Pliny's letter and how he says that Pliny was appointed prosecutor with other judges. How come no one is ever able to describe this letter in a way that matches its modern text until the 1500s? Much more on that later in the series, but here's where I would cite more Christian mentions of Pliny's letter, but unfortunately, we have literally exhausted all mentions of it until the medieval period. But if Pliny's letter was truly as negative and nasty for Christians as it's purported to be, and again, that's one of the main arguments for its authenticity that apologists usually deploy, such confusion about its intent among these ancient writers wouldn't exist. But the letter of Antoninus from our reading and the letter of Pliny to Trajan, as we said, emanate from two different schools, even though they were both forged. And at a minimum, our reading from today and the one from our last show have, I hope, gone a long way toward demonstrating that Christians forged imperial edicts having to do with persecution, no matter how weird, no matter how stupid that seems. Like, we as modern people, and probably some listeners when I first said this a few episodes ago, were like, wait, so they forged something in the emperor's name? I mean, wouldn't there have been an easy and obvious way to detect this? And then what did they expect? That a Roman governor was going to read this and go like, well, no problems here. It says it's from the emperor, and so all you Christians can go free. You know, we as modern people are confused by these things, but they happened. And the ultimate fact is that these are indeed all forgeries, including Pliny's letter, and creating them made sense in some way to the 2nd century mainstream Christian clergy. You're listening to Born in the 2nd Century, and it's now September 22nd, 2021. This is episode 14 of the tri-weekly endeavor to expose the origins of Christianity as late and legendary, hosted by Chris Palmero in an audio format. The music for today's broadcast was provided by the recording group Pompey Gray. We continue our close reading of Pliny's letter to Trajan concerning the Christians, supposedly written in the year 112 AD from the province of Bithynia and Pontus. I'm of course maintaining that this document is a forgery from the hand of a Christian cleric in the late 2nd century, and thereby doesn't prevent us from putting the origins of Christianity itself in the 100s AD. With this, we are essentially reading the letter, and we're stopping every so often with commentary, and in that commentary, we are deploying our arguments against authenticity, the red cards that I introduced in episode 10 when this series began. And this series began, by the way, on July 4th, and I don't know, it's not only Americans who listen to this show, so you may not be aware, but July 4th is our Independence Day against the alien invasion. It's when President Thomas Whitmore stood up and said, "We will not go quietly into the night. We will not vanish without a fight." And on July 4th of the year 2021, we finally declared our independence from the tyranny of Pliny's letter, its brutal imperial rule over the paradigm of Christian origins that has so long prevented us from placing the origins of this religion in their proper time period. And as we move forward throughout this series, we always want to keep our key question in mind, which is whether it's indeed impossible to tag this monstrosity as a forgery. And I think we're showing that it's not impossible. Back after this. A reading from a fake letter of a CIA station chief to the director of the CIA. Greetings. Since I've been in country, I've had a lot of trouble dealing with those who are openly calling themselves terrorists. I've never dealt with people like this, and I don't know what the charge against them usually is. For one thing, I'm not sure whether it's enough to punish someone just because they're openly identifying themselves as a terrorist, or whether there has to be evidence of crimes usually associated with terrorism, terrorist acts, in order for them to be punished. In the case of those denounced to me as terrorists, I've so far observed the following procedure. I asked them whether they did identify as terrorists. Those who said yes, I asked a second and third time, warning of the punishment. Those who persisted, I sent to a black site. Because I had no doubt that whatever the implications were of them identifying themselves as terrorists, stubbornness and obstinacy ought to be punished. We are fighting a war on terror after all, and if you're not with us, you're against us. There were others possessed of the same madness, but because there was some evidence that they were American citizens, I sent them to the FBI liaison. Soon the accusations spread, and different forms of the charge turned up. An anonymous pamphlet was sent to me containing the names of many people. Those who denied that they now identified or had ever identified as terrorists when they said the Pledge of Allegiance in front of me, and offered a can of Miller High Life to an image of Jenna Bush. These I discharged. Others, named by an informant, said that they used to identify as terrorists 25 years ago, but had ceased doing so. They said that the sum total of their crimes back then had been to gather at dawn and sing terrorism songs and bind themselves by an oath never to commit acts of terrorism. I therefore decided to postpone the matter and consult you, especially because of the number of people in danger. It seems possible to check and cure this problem. It's easy to imagine what a multitude of people can be reformed if an opportunity for repentance is given." End quote. And now a fake response from the CIA director. "You followed the procedure you ought to have followed in examining the cases of those brought before you who identified as terrorists. For no rule with a universal application, such as would have, as it were, a fixed form, can be laid down. They should not be sought out. If they're prosecuted and proved to be guilty of identifying as a terrorist, they should be punished, provided, however, that the man who denies that he's a terrorist and makes this evident by his actions, that is, by eating an Arch Deluxe and downloading a Drake single, shall obtain pardon for his repentance. However, pamphlets posted up without an author's name ought to have no place in any criminal charge, because they set the worst precedent and are out of keeping with the Constitution of the United States." End quote. That was just a thought exercise. And the only thing I would add to it is that it was set in the time of President George W. Bush. So imagine that also in that universe that a group who identified as terrorists had also had government action taken against them during both the Clinton and Reagan administrations. And in fact, during the Reagan administration, they had been implicated in a very serious bombing plot. And the analogy there is, of course, the Neronian persecution during the Great Fire. And assume further that this CIA station chief had lived and worked in Washington, D.C. that entire time. In the last episode, we continued the close reading. We're moving at a fair clip. We covered 2 sentences. And now we return. When we last left Pliny the Younger, he had said that he'd never been present at trials of Christians and didn't know what the charge usually is. And that sentence alone caused us to throw up enough red cards already to ban him for the entire season, but we have to continue for no other reason than we have to really see what the depth of this problem really is. So let's recommence, and hey, hopefully things might improve for Pliny here as we move further into the letter. We pick up where we left off. Pliny, activate. Nec mediocriter hasitavi, sine aliquod discriminaitatum an quam libe teneri nihila robustioribus differant. Detor penitentiae venia, an qui omnino Christianos fuit, decise non prosit. Nomen ipsum si flagitis careat, an flagitia coerentia nomini puniantur. I've been in no little uncertainty as to whether any distinction should be made between different ages, or whether, however young they may be, they should be treated no different than the mature ones. Whether pardon should be granted for repentance, or whether it's of no help to the man who's been a Christian at all to have given it up. Whether it's the name itself, if it's free from crimes, or the crimes associated with the name are being punished. End quote. Red card. Peculiarities of situation. Pliny asks 3 questions here. 1, whether there's to be any distinction when it comes to the Christian's age. 2, whether to pardon the Christians if they deny their faith. And 3, whether we're supposed to be punishing them for Christianity itself or for, as he very awkwardly puts it, the crimes associated with being a Christian. It's Pliny's future. I see a red card that will eventually give him for that statement as well, but more on that later. What's peculiar about this situation is that Trajan only ends up responding to one of these 3 questions. The second one, if he can in fact be said to be directly responding to Pliny's letter at all, which is a whole other question in itself. Trajan's response to Pliny is that if someone is prosecuted and found guilty of being a Christian, then they obtain pardon for repentance. And that technically answers Pliny's question number 2, although, as we'll see when we cover Trajan's response, it doesn't appear as if he's answering the question in the way that Pliny specifically framed it. Trajan then adds that when the repentant Christian is pardoned, he's pardoned however suspect he may be with regard to the past. Now, the forger is in a difficult position here because he is effectively... Remember how in episode 11, when I talked about how weird it was, that the early Christians kept saying that the Romans would accuse them of eating an infant, but they would be totally cleared of crimes like that if they merely repented of being a Christian. I mean, well, it's one thing For a chucklehead like Justin Martyr to say things like that in a book that maybe 15 other people on Earth were even aware of at the time, and those 15 were all fellow clerics. It's quite another thing to have the ruler of the universe say it, and that's the problem the forger's encountering with Trajan's response. He realized how ridiculous it would have sounded to have Trajan directly say that, yeah, if a Christian denies his faith, he also gets the Anne Hathaway, Catwoman, clean slate that clears him of incest and orgies and cannibalism and infanticide. So he has Trajan say it in this kind of Blue's Clues fashion where we have to piece it together on our own. Now, if we're playing along that this letter is genuine and early, then Pliny would not have had a chance to read the writings of Justin Martyr and Tertullian or any of those forged rescripts, and he didn't have a chance to read the Acts of Pilate. He's at a disadvantage because Trajan's response, where he cryptically alludes to the fact that Christians are clear of any charges of the secondary crimes, Trajan's statement on this would only make sense to someone who had read those books, because the idea that a Christian would be cleared of the charge of incest, for example, if he merely denied his faith, is something that would make sense only to a contemporary Christian. The forger, however, has to have that spelled out in plain writing. So he has Pliny ask whether the name itself is free from crimes or whether we're supposed to be punishing the crimes associated with it. It would be an embarrassing statement for a Roman administrator to write. If Christianity itself was a crime in the Roman Empire and a Christian was charged with that and with infanticide, the Roman administrator would rather punish both crimes. It wouldn't make sense to them to combine the two, and let you off the hook for both if you were innocent of one. The forger finds himself backed into a corner here because the ancient apologists created a myth that said, we are being persecuted merely because we are Christians. And that wasn't true because there was no law on the books condemning mere Christianity, as we've shown. So these apologists had to concoct a scenario to explain how, in their minds, Christians could end up in front of a tribunal. And what they decided on was that when we are brought before a tribunal, it's because of the unspeakable crimes that the mob accuses us of, the flagitia, the things like incest and infanticide and so on. That makes sense in a book that's only ever going to be read by other Christians, but here they're forging a document in the name of actual Roman leaders, one of whom technically has the power to issue laws ex cathedra, and we immediately see how awkward it is. Once this persecution myth is taken out of its laboratory conditions, which is the only environment it can survive in, and placed in the real world, well, Pliny the lawyer asks a question that doesn't make sense in the context of Roman law, and because it doesn't make sense in the context of Roman law, the forger can only have Trajan respond to it cryptically. Now, the forger also throws out a red herring here, which is Pliny's first question, that is, whether the Christian's age makes a difference in their trial and punishment. Now, the 2nd century Roman jurist Papinian said that when it came to incest, the Romans generally would excuse the crime on the grounds of age as long as the incestuous relationship ended. The same thing with adultery. In discussing the crime of forgery, another 2nd century lawyer tells us that a child under the age of puberty can hardly be liable, as he's not capable of criminality at that age. Torture couldn't be inflicted on someone under the age of 14, and as for older people who were considered infirm, there were certain punishments that couldn't be inflicted on them. It would seem to me that Pliny would know all that, but in fact, theologians have said that the reason that Trajan doesn't bother to respond to that question about whether age has any impact on the proceedings is because he indeed thought that Pliny should know that, and so he just kind of coldly ignores that question like he's managing down. But I think, and this is why I issued a red card, I think what the forger did was have Pliny ask 3 questions as a way to cover his tracks and make it seem more like a real request for advice, because otherwise, it looks like Pliny would only be asking 2 questions that both of them derive solely from the persecution trope. The question about the defendant's age is just filler, basically. And it's also like a first-year law student question, which is strange indeed when coming from this celebrated barrister with 5 decades of experience. Now, some might argue that, well, Christianity is kind of a new thing. Maybe Pliny does know how age factors in when it comes to other crimes, but not this one. Well, in that case, then why the fuck does Trajan ignore that part of his question? So Pliny and Trajan get 5 minutes in the penalty box for this bit with the questions and answers. Moving on. Now, I was going to red card Pliny because of his implication here that there are Christians in Bithynia and Pontus that are old enough to where he feels that their advanced age needs to be taken into account when he's trying their case. Let's assume that he's talking here about people who are 60 and older. Keep in mind, these are not implied to be older converts to Christianity because he, in the same breath, mentions that there are also very young Christians who are implied to be minors. Hence, what the forger is envisioning here is a community of Christians such as he would be familiar with from the late 2nd century, people of all ages. And we know that such communities existed in that time from sources like the Didascalia and from Irenaeus and others. In fact, the Didascalia talks about the seating arrangements in the churches and making sure that the older people, like whom we would call senior citizens, making sure that they get good seats that are easily accessible, just like in modern churches. Well, the two questions that we would have to answer here about Pliny's letter are, one, would there have been a Christian community anywhere in the world in the year 112 that looked like this? And two, if we determine that such a community could have existed in 112, which is far from a given, could such a community have existed in Pontus, which I could not explain to you how much of a backwater this place was, even if I devoted 12 episodes to it. But these are questions that we will have to consider later in the series because Pliny will start throwing out time durations and dates, and it'll be much more appropriate to discuss them then. But for now, I'm putting Pliny on a warning for this statement about there being very old and very young Christians in Pontus in 112 AD. It's a verbal warning. Obviously, 3 strikes and he's out, and something's got to change. Moving on. I want to now quickly yellow card Pliny on peculiarities of style, since his 3 questions are chiastic. They follow a poetic structure. Check it out. He wants to know whether any distinction should be made between different ages, or whether, however young they may be, they should be treated no different than the mature ones. He wants to know whether pardon should be granted for repentance, or whether it's of no help to the man who's been a Christian at all to have given it up. He wants to know whether the name itself is free from crimes, or whether the crimes associated with the name are being punished. I mean, is this Pliny letter really supposed to be like a song? Do we need to play a backing track to sufficiently analyze this piece? Like, do we need to get Pompey Gray in here? Like, what, did Pliny have like a Greek slave standing behind him beatboxing while he wrote these questions? Now, it's only a yellow card, though, because one of the questions about Pliny's letters in general has always been like to what extent he cleaned them up and rewrote them prior to publication. Although, in the case of Book 10, the consensus is that he actually died before he had a chance to do that for the letters that he wrote to Trajan. But I'm keeping this at yellow card level because I don't want a classicist with a lot of time on his hands to do like an 8-part YouTube series in response to this and be like, actually, the poetic nature of these questions follows the standard practice of ancient rhetoric in which Pliny was extremely well versed. I mean, for me, I just think that the forger being steeped in Christian literature, including the early acts of the martyrs, was using the tropes from those books where the Roman officials basically speak in literary devices. Moving on and issuing Pliny another red card for the persecution trope, and this is a big one. Pliny asks Trajan whether the name itself, that is, being a Christian, should be punished, or if the crimes associated with the names should be punished. I mentioned this earlier and red carded the letter because Trajan didn't directly address this question in his response, but now the question itself gets a red card. First of all, this phrase in itself exposes the entire letter as a forgery. In fact, this whole series could have been 10 minutes long and just been a discussion about this phrase alone, the one about whether we should punish the name or the associated crimes. Because his question here basically amounts to, is Christianity the crime, or are the crimes the crimes? I mean, the mere fact that he's calling them crimes obviates his entire purpose in writing the letter. It already answers his question. Now, he could have said, what about a Christian who's guilty of being a Christian, but appears to not be guilty of any of the secondary crimes? In fact, that is what this letter logically should say, but the forger cannot have it say that, because his concern is the exaggerated, embellished persecution accounts that he's responding to. And his goal here with this forgery is to have a Roman emperor say that if you deny Christianity, you are not liable for the unspeakable crimes. That way, if wavering Christians or heretics in his local area deny their faith, the persecution ends at that point. The forger's goal is to merge the legal treatment of mere Christianity with that of the unspeakable crimes, almost like an eclipse where it's like the moon completely covering the sun. And so like if you're acquitted of one charge, you're acquitted of all. It's a way to limit exposure. But it's the kind of thing that only makes sense to a contemporary Christian, because if Pliny is already aware of crimes, then he would have just punished those, like the Hadrian letter said in our last opening reading, and like the Antoninus letter said in today's opening reading. And also like the CIA station chief in my thought exercise from earlier. And notice how in that, this idea of separating the name of terrorist from actual terrorist acts created a kind of a plot hole where the station chief didn't think to examine whether these people committed any terrorist acts. He just punishes them for not denying the name of terrorist. Now, this is the key discussion upon which the authenticity of this letter hinges. Someone arguing for its authenticity would say here that Pliny is somehow aware that Christianity itself is a crime and also that it's associated with other crimes. And he starts out by punishing people for mere Christianity, but he's finding no evidence of those other crimes, so he's questioning Trajan as to whether Christianity itself should indeed be considered a crime. And that is how the letter is indeed structured. But my response to that would be, there are two possible scenarios that would have resulted in these people standing in Pliny's court. One, they were accused of being Christians. Two, they were accused of the unspeakable crimes associated with being Christians. And it's clearly not number two. We're not given any indication of that from Pliny, nor does he suggest that. In fact, he suggests quite the opposite when he launches his own investigation, like, what are these people actually up to? So we conclude that they were brought before him for the crime of being Christians. And so why is Pliny made to appear unsure to punish them for that crime? And also, what is the purpose of him writing to Trajan at all? Because it seems like what he's really saying is, should we really be punishing these people for a mere name, especially when they haven't committed any crimes? In other words, he's saying exactly what the late 2nd century apologists said. If we are to take this letter as genuine, then Pliny's procedure was already mapped out before he ever even wrote the letter. He could either have investigated the secondary crimes, or he could have investigated the name. But he seems to be confused about both options. I'm going to now paraphrase something that the wrestler CM Punk said in an interview. Either Pliny is dumb as fuck, or this letter is structured this way on purpose. And against the charge of Pliny being dumb as fuck, we can enter into evidence most of the other letters in Book 10 where he appears to be fairly conscientious on these questions of crime and punishment. We're not dealing with a bad administrator here. The letter was structured this way on purpose. The forger wants the Roman procedure on persecution as he understands it to change. And so he needs a Roman administrator to suggest that, hey, it's kind of weird that we're going after these people for a mere name, even though there's crimes associated with it, when they don't really seem to be doing anything wrong. If all we're punishing them for is a name, then wouldn't it be better to just give them a chance to deny that name? And if they do, we just consider them cleared of those associated crimes? So unless Pliny was so signally incompetent as not to execute sentence on people who are identifying as Christians, unless he was in fact a saintly advocate on behalf of Christians here, felt sorry for them, we must default to the hypothesis that this was a Christian forger trying to inject himself into the contemporary legal discussion. By the way, as I said, Pliny uses the phrase, the crimes associated with the name, flagitia coherentia nomini. We know what those are because we've read the Christian books from the late 100s AD. Did Pliny also read those books? Did Trajan? Did it not seem important to Pliny here to at least briefly list what those crimes were? Seems pretty important. He throws out the phrase, the crimes associated with the name, as if these are well known and require no explanation. We are being asked by the theologians to accept that Trajan and Pliny have all this backstory about Christianity that they're just leaving unsaid here. Theologians have said, well, Pliny doesn't need to clarify what he's talking about because, of course, the crimes associated with the Christian name would have been well known from the time of Nero, the time of Domitian. Well, if those historical persecutions never occurred, then we are back to square one, and we now need to ask why Pliny is leaving out so much pertinent information. Added to which, we are also being asked to accept that Pliny doesn't know much about Christianity, doesn't know what the charge usually is, doesn't actually know what the Christians believe, what they do in their meetings, but he knows about these unspeakable crimes. And in fact, he and Trajan know them so well that he doesn't even feel compelled to at least briefly summarize them. What happened here was the forger felt confident to include this phrase, crimes associated with the name, because it already made sense to the Christian fan base. Now, just as an aside before moving on, since we talked about the flagitia, the unspeakable crimes, I mentioned in the last episode that the usual early sources that are cited as witnesses to Christianity in this period are Pliny, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Josephus. And I said that all 4 of them have had questions raised against their authenticity. The 3 pagan sources all portray Christianity as in some way menacing. Tacitus calls it a destructive superstition and says that Christians were hated for their flagitia. Suetonius calls it a wicked superstition. And of course, Pliny here is freaking out like fucking Alpha 5 from Power Rangers and talking about how it's a danger to every age and class and gender. And he's talking also, of course, about the flagitia. Now, all 3 of these references, if they're genuine, date to this same decade of the 110s AD. Now, the Roman satirist Lucian wrote about Christians in the 170s and the 180s. And no one, including me, has ever suspected that his references to Christians are not genuine. And in his books, Christians are never portrayed as being sinister or guilty of these unspeakable crimes or flagitia. To him, they're just a bunch of simple dopes. And keep in mind 2 things with that. 1, Christians were far more numerous in the time of Lucian. And 2, in Lucian's time, if we want to believe Justin Martyr, the Romans were already supposed to be persecuting Christians as a matter of course. Yet Lucian knows nothing of any of these stereotypes, even where he tells us far, far more about Christians than Pliny or Tacitus or Suetonius does. Like, Lucian gives us the Christian setting in life. He lives in the 170s. He sees Christians in his environment in the 170s. So he tells us how they act and behave in the 170s from his perspective. A Christian forging the Pliny letter in 190 AD, forging the Tacitus passage in 380 AD, forging the Josephus passage in 310, would not have known these things, would not have known how contemporary Christians lived and behaved, and would not have felt confident to make them up. So they just keep it generic. And so it seems clear to me that the references in these earlier writers where they're throwing around terms like noxious and maleficent when describing Christians and assuming they commit crimes, assuming that the name itself is suspect, these were indeed forged in a much later time when that was the standard view of the church. The Romans accuse us of unspeakable crimes and punish us for the name. And they're also keeping it safe by only writing the stereotypical things that they assume that Romans would have said about Christians. As we can see from Lucian in the 170s, and he's like a sort of Hellenistic Andrew Dice Clay who's more than willing to mock these people and everything about them, no indication whatsoever of Christians being notorious for the unspeakable crimes. Something to consider. And speaking of the name, we got something else for Pliny. Another red card. Mere anachronism. Pliny asked whether the name itself is being punished. Now, modern Christians don't look too kindly on Pliny the Younger, but they ought to rethink that because he's a pretty cool guy, in fact. Because he was kind enough to use the unique Jewish and Christian in-house designation for what it is that they're so honored to die for, the name. Justin Martyr says, "No one can utter the name of the ineffable God." Lactantius from the 4th century says, "His name is not known even to the angels who dwell in heaven, but to himself only, and to God the Father. Nor will that name be published before the purpose of God is fulfilled. And this name can't be uttered by the mouth of man." Referring to the deity as the name is a concept that Christians borrowed from Judaism as Hashem. Now, we are trained to read such statements as this one by Pliny as saying that the Christians are being persecuted for the name of Christian. And of course, it doesn't help that like half of the early apologists also make that same mistake, often multiple times in the same writing, sometimes multiple times in the same paragraph, when they rally from reading the name as that of Christian to that of God or Christ. But when the Talmud says that the Jewish martyrs died for the sake of glorifying the name, are we to understand that as saying that they died to glorify the name of Jew? No, they died to glorify the name of God. I actually tend to think that Justin Martyr was the original person who introduced this confusion into the record, that is, reading the name as that of Christian and not that of Christ or God, because in his apology book, he starts out by talking about how Christians die for the name, and there he clearly means the name of Christian. And he even says, like, you don't kill people for having the name of philosophers, even though some philosophers have done and said some really questionable things. But then later on, he changes that and he starts saying that, okay, we're hated for the name of Christ, and we confess the name of Christ. This idea of dying for something called the name, though, is a thoroughly Jewish concept and could not, in fact, possibly be any more Jewish. But Justin Martyr is one of these guys who's under the delusion that Christianity is something completely distinct from Judaism. And so he's kind of inventing systems and codes and conventions on the fly to try to separate the two. So to him, when Christians are found to be dying for the name, to him, that ought to carry a completely different connotation than it does in Judaism. Now, in the 190s AD, the Christian theologian Irenaeus says this about those who follow the arch-heretic Basilides, quote, "They say, know all, but let no one know you. Because of this, people of this persuasion are also ready to recant. In fact, to them, it's impossible that they should suffer on account of a mere name, since they are alike to all." End quote. What he essentially means is that these heretics put no significance in names because the truth about the heavens is unknown. So they're not about to die for a name. And it should be clear that when they say that they're not dying for a name, they mean that they're not dying for the name of the deity. Irenaeus also says about the Christians who follow the arch-heretic Carpocrates, quote, "They lead a licentious life, and to conceal their impious doctrines, they abuse the name as a means of hiding their wickedness. So their condemnation is just when they get a recompense from God that's suited to their works." End quote. He said that they abuse the name. Are we to understand that as them abusing the name of Christian? No, it only makes sense if he meant that they're abusing the name of Christ. So this part of Pliny's letter alone, where he talks about punishment for the name, is to me enough to tag the whole thing as a forgery, and I defy anyone to tell me why Pliny is using the special in-group terminology here, especially when he represents himself as not knowing anything about Christians or what they believe. But the forger is using it here, because it was an established element of the Christian literature of his time. Outside of Pliny's letter and the early Christian apologists and theologians of a century later, no Roman ever refers to the punishment of Christians as punishment for the name, even in the 3rd century, even in the 4th century. But it was part of the forger's literary world, and so it now becomes part of Pliny's literary world. Back after this. Pliny, activate. Interim, isqui ad me tamquam Christiani deferabantur huncsum secutus modum. Interrogavi ipsos an essent Christiani. Confidentes iterum acteltio interrogavi, supplicium inatus, persorante studiusi. Neque enim dubitavam, qualecumque esset quad fatirentor, pertinaciam certe, et inflexibilem obstinationem debere puniri. Fuerunt ali similes ementiae, quos, quia cives Romani erant, ad notavi in urbem remittendos. Mox ipso tractato ut fiere solet, diffundentes e crimine, plures species inciderunt. Propositus es libello sine actore motorum nomina continens. Qui negabant esse Christianos, aut fuise, cum praeonte me, Deos appellarent er imagine tuae, quam propter hoc isueram cum simulacris numinum adferi, ture aquino supplicarent, praeterea maledicerent Christo, quorum nihil cogi posse dicuntur, qui sunt vera Christiani, dimittendos putavi. Meanwhile, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, I have observed the following procedure. I asked the people themselves whether they were Christians. Those who confessed that they were, I asked a second and a third time, warning them of the punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered to be executed. For I had no doubt that whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy surely deserved to be punished. There were others possessed of the same madness, but because they were Roman citizens, I signed an order for them to be transferred to the city. Soon, accusations spread, as usually happens, because of the proceedings going on, and the charge spread widely, and more forms of it turned up. An anonymous pamphlet was published containing the names of many people. Those who denied that they were or had been Christians when they invoked the gods in words dictated by me, offered incense and wine to your image, which I'd ordered to be brought for this purpose, together with statues of the gods, and also cursed Christ, none of which those who are really Christians, it is said, can be forced to do. These I decided to discharge. End quote. Red card. Persecution trope. This is actually the main problem with the letter, as I said back in episode 10. Pliny divides the accused Christians into 3 distinct groups, each of which is brought before him by their own unique means of accusation. We've got the first 2 groups here in the section we've just read, and next time when we continue the reading, we'll get into the third. Now, just to show how artificial this setup really is, I want us to imagine Pliny playing a kind of video game here. Now, some, when they think about Pliny the Younger in the context of a video game, you already know the Bart's Nightmare reference is coming. A lot of people, when they think about Pliny the Younger in the context of a video game, they may think of something like Phoenix Wright, Ace Attorney, or Aviary Attorney. But of course, I think a game like Bart's Nightmare works really well here too, because in that game, there are stages with mini bosses. When you beat them, you transition to the next part of the level. So we fire up our game here, Pliny's Nightmare, and Pliny begins making his way through the level, and he encounters his first mini-boss. This is the first group of Christians that he's dealing with. They are the confessors, people who admit to being a Christian, confitentes, as he said, and they were brought before Pliny by the regular Roman process of initiating a trial, which was called delation. This was when someone brought you in, didn't necessarily have to be a lawyer, could be a private citizen. Someone accuses you of a crime, and they're responsible for formally prosecuting you. And that's what Pliny means when he says that this group of Christians was brought before him. And as I said, these people have no problem admitting to being a Christian. Now, he kills them, has them executed. In the mind of modern Christians, he likely earned a place in hell for that action, but unborn in the 2nd century, I'm somewhat more forgiving. I'll only be punishing him with a red card. But Pliny has successfully faced his first challenge. He has defeated the first mini-boss, and he can now proceed to the next section of this level of the persecution video game. After a while, he encounters a second group of Christians, and these were accused not by a formal prosecutor as with the first group. These were brought to his attention by an anonymous pamphlet, what he calls a libello sine auctore, literally a little book without an author. And this ends up being the second mini-boss that Pliny encounters, the deniers. They're the ones who end up abandoning their faith. Now, Pliny successfully found the weakness of the first mini-boss, the confessing Christians, which was to ask them repeatedly if they were Christians, executing them if they said yes. So that was a pretty easy mini-boss battle for him, that first group, as far as these things go. But this second boss, the deniers, poses more of a challenge. But Pliny eventually figures out that the way to tackle this fight is to compel these people to offer wine and incense to the image of the emperor and to statues of the gods and to curse Christ. They do this, and he ends up letting them go. And so Pliny successfully defeats this second mini-boss, and he has completed this second level of the persecution video game. But then he'll eventually get to the main boss, the third group of Christians, the apostates. These are the ones who are not really in a position to confess or deny their faith, because they've already given it up years ago. And this group is also brought before Pliny by its own unique accusation type, in this case, an anonymous informer, or what's called in Latin an index. And that mini-boss and that stage of the level will pose the greatest problem for Pliny, and that's what we'll get to later in the series. But here we have the 3 nice, neat groups: confessors, deniers, apostates. Just like Matthew Broderick writing on that chalkboard in the election movie year after year, again and again: legislative, executive, judicial. Now, the joke there in that movie is that what he's teaching is so formulaic. Year in, year out, he's teaching these high school students information which is presumably new to them, but very repetitive to him. And it belies what he himself is saying in the voiceover about finding so much joy in his work. Well, the writer of Pliny's letter also appears to be dealing with something which he and his fellow clerics have gone over many times. And indeed, the late 2nd and early 3rd century clerics did go over this issue many times. It's all over their books. It would also end up becoming the hot-button issue later in the 3rd century. To what extent is it acceptable to recant one's faith in times of persecution? The beginnings of that debate are already occurring in the books of Justin, Clement, Tertullian, here at the end of the 100s when the Pliny letter was forged. But notice also how artificial this whole scenario is. Notice how, for example, in the group of confessors, the first mini-boss, he interrogates them. Notice how he doesn't mention that anyone denied their faith from that group. And the logic of the letter dictates that that should have happened because remember, he says, these people were brought before me for formal prosecution, and I asked them whether they were Christians. Those who said yes, I asked the second and third time. Those who persisted, I ordered to be executed. He's clearly implying that there were people who denied their faith among that first group, but for some reason, he doesn't bring them up at all in that context and doesn't talk about what procedure he applied to them at that time. He only brings up anyone denying their faith when he talks about the second crowd, the one from the anonymous pamphlet, and in that group, he doesn't mention there about any of them confessing their faith. So the first group, he mentions nothing but confessors. The second group, he mentions nothing but deniers. Sounds very formulaic. And so what is the forger up to here? Now, one of the biggest experts on persecution of Christians was the late theologian Geoffrey de Saint Croix. He analyzed the Pliny letter and came up with the names of these three groups, the confessors, the deniers, and the apostates. I'm borrowing that from him, and here's what he says after he gets done discussing it. Quote, "One may suspect that Pliny has oversimplified, and that in practice, the situation was not quite so tidy, but that need not concern us here." End quote. It didn't concern him there, but one thing you can be damn sure of is that it concerns me here. This careful division of the accused Christians into three distinct groups, three distinct accusation types, is of no concern to the theologian. It should be the main concern of someone exposing this document as a forgery. What the forger is up to here is that he's choosing to take Pliny on a journey in which Pliny learns about all the different types of Christians and the various different ways in which they're accused, and the forger is letting it play out in a way that he imagines that it would take place from the trials that he's familiar with from the writings of Justin Martyr and others. Remember the outcome that he wants to achieve, what he writes in Trajan's response. First of all, if you accuse a Christian, it must be done formally, and execution can only take place if the accused is proved to be a Christian. Well, a group of Christians is brought before Pliny by a formal prosecutor. He asks them 3 times if they confess, warns them of punishment, they still confess, and they end up getting their martyr's reward. He gives them 3 chances to back out. The goal that the forger envisions is that only true Christians, that is the Orthodox Christians, will ever end up being charged by a formal prosecutor. And here, where they persist in confessing their faith despite being given 3 chances to back out, and here's also where the forger's sneaking in some backhanded praise of Christians, so we can also call this a red card for low-key Christian propaganda. The confessors persist despite being given 3 chances to deny and being warned of the punishment. These are true Christians. And again, in the situation that the forger wants to bring about, only true Christians will ever end up in this position of being formally on trial. And of course, they're not going to deny at that point, and that's why Pliny in this section doesn't talk about any of them denying. Then the forger has Pliny say that the charge spread widely and more forms of it turned up. Which, by the way, is suspicious language in and of itself. Like, how could there be more than one form of practicing Christianity unless he's talking about heretics? But the author is afraid to make him explicitly use that term. But here we start to get to the groups of Christians that the forger considers less seemly, the ones that he wants to be able to get clear of their accusations so as to limit the exposure of him and his own parishioners. These are weak Christians or heretics, or those who have been influenced by the teaching of heretics, particularly that teaching that was so common among them that gave them the idea that denying their faith was okay. And accordingly, in this second group of Christians, all of them that he mentions deny their faith. They obediently honor the traditional gods and the image of the emperor. And remember that these were the ones that were named by an anonymous broadsheet, and the forger also explains that there was a huge crowd of these fools. He says many names were contained in the pamphlet. The forger recognizes what a problem it would be if anyone could just anonymously accuse anyone whom they thought to be a Christian, and he recognizes that if anonymous pamphlets were allowed, any number of people could be listed on them, dozens or hundreds, members of his own church. I mean, where does it stop? So he crafts a scenario where a giant horde of Christians is listed on a pamphlet, and they're somehow all brought before Pliny in an efficient and timely manner. Like the policing in this backwater of Pontus is more effective than we saw in that movie Minority Report, but they all deny their faith using a set stereotyped procedure, and they all go free. And Trajan will later bitch about how anonymous pamphlets should never be used. So what the forger did here was to create a scenario to demonstrate how unwieldy this idea is of accusing people of being Christians via an anonymous pamphlet. You'll have to end up killing like 1,500 oxen for these people to do some bullshit sacrifice test. Or in this case, I guess, go through like 1,200 bottles of wine for them to offer to the gods, and they'll all end up going free anyway, and it wastes everyone's time. What the forger is also doing here is creating a scenario in which those who deny their faith get to roll clear of the nuclear blast, and the stigma of their accusations doesn't spread to his own Orthodox group. I think that the forger's greatest mistake in this entire letter, and the whole reason why anyone has ever thought to consider this letter to be a forgery, And by the way, the initial reason why this letter was doubted in the 19th century was not because the people who doubted it were trying to tear down Christianity. Such an idea wouldn't have occurred to most of them. They doubted the letter because it contains all kinds of weird-ass shit like this. But like I said, where the forger really screwed the pooch here was trying to frame this whole thing from the assumption that Pliny doesn't know anything about Christianity. The forger needed that to be the case, to allow him to initiate his parade of tropes, but the result is that therefore, whenever Pliny opens his mouth, he appears to know a lot more about Christianity than he'd in fact been letting on. In fact, when we start looking at things like the Acts of the Martyrs, Pliny ends up knowing just as much about Christianity as he needs to, just as much as the stereotypical persecutor should. Back after this. I'll now briefly issue a yellow card to Pliny for peculiarities of style when he refers to Christianity as a madness or amentia. This is an example of what I meant about the forger pulling his punches by not saying anything too terribly negative about Christianity. And here he calls it a madness. Whoa, can he say that? To give you a sense of how this word amentia was used in Latin literature, I'll quote the poet Horace. If an old person with a long beard takes delight in building baby houses, in yoking mice to a go-kart, at playing at odds and evens, and riding on a long cane, amentia must be his motive. End quote. Sounds pretty dangerous, and I really do get the sense from Pliny's use of this term that we're dealing here with a relentless evil that's putting everyone in Bithynia in danger. Moving on. Pliny the Younger now gets a flag on the play for peculiarities of the situation when he says that he warned the Christians of the punishment when he asked them whether they were a Christian. He says that when they didn't heed his warning, he executed them. My sir, I thought you said that you didn't even know what the charge usually is. But okay, now not only do you know the charge, but also the punishment. But he's not done yet. He explains that the reason he executed the confessing Christians was because stubbornness and obstinacy deserved to be punished. Now, what happened here was that the forger caught himself because he recognized that in the first few lines, he had Pliny say that he didn't know what the charge usually was, like I said, but according to the persecution trope, the charge is being a Christian, and if you're a Christian, you get executed. But if Pliny was made to say that he executed people for being a Christian, then, again, there was no need for him to write this letter in the first damn place. You already know that they're suspected Christians. You're putting the question to them 2 and 3 times. The persecution trope says that you must therefore execute. And the spurious reason that the forger comes up with for Pliny to execute them is that they were obstinate. What kind of kangaroo court is this allegedly celebrated lawyer purporting to run here? Fuck's going on down there? This is probably the most frustrating aspect for me when arguing about Pliny's letter. It's when those who argue for its authenticity completely gloss over the outrageous things that Pliny is being made to say here. They're like, yeah, it makes sense, he executed them for being stubborn. And then the big commentators like Sherwin White try to rescue this passage by throwing out all these technical Roman legal terms like contumacia and obstinatio. But I mean, just look at how ridiculous this situation is here at face value. He asks them, are you a Christian? Yes. Are you a Christian? Yes. Are you a Christian? Yes. And then he says, okay, you are hereby sentenced to death for pissing me off, basically, by saying yes 3 times in a row. And also, why would he even admit any of this to Trajan? This is shameful. And why would Trajan not address this heinous injustice in his response? Now, the funny thing is, if the letter had merely said, I asked them 3 times, and they said yes 3 times, so I executed them for being Christians, that would have made sense. That would have fit the logic of the universe that's being presented to us here, but it can't say that because Pliny's whole premise for writing is that he's confused about the charge and needs Trajan to clarify, and yet the persecution trope needs victims, Christians have to be seen to be punished for the name, so they are technically punished for the name. Yet Pliny has to give a nonsensical reason to justify why he punished them. It's obvious fiction, and this is one of those cases where the forgery here is rather obvious. So, next red card. I don't even bother to say next sentence at this point. We just immediately default to next red card. And the next red card is actually 2 in 1 for intertextuality. One is for the fact that before Pliny warns the confessing Christians of punishment, he puts the question to them a second and third time. And the other red card is the fact that during this process, the confessing Christians remain stoic and silent and don't attempt to plead their case. I, of course, refer you to the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, in which Pilate puts the question to Jesus twice, and during all that, Jesus remains silent in the Synoptic Gospels, or at least he certainly doesn't dispute the charges. Not necessarily in the Gospel of John, where he yammers on and on like he's sitting on Oprah's couch, but the silence or submission of the accused Christians at their trials was a common trope in the Acts of the Martyrs from the late 100s, and especially throughout the 200s. And the martyrs would often maintain this silence after they'd been asked by the judge if they were Christians at least 2 times. Now, the Acts of the Martyrs are a series of short books from the late 2nd century and from the 3rd century, and they tend to follow the story of a heroic Christian from the time of their arrest all the way to the time of their execution. And we find that Pliny has obviously been carefully studying his copies of the Acts of the Martyrs here, because this is yet another instance in which he's years ahead of his time when he deploys the repetitive questioning and gives the Christians a chance to recant, just as we find in those books. In those books, the repeated questioning and the silence of the accused is unquestionably a Christian trope, and its purpose is to demonstrate to the Christian reader that these people most certainly were given multiple chances to deny their faith, and the fact that they didn't means that we should admire them all the more. And the forger has made ample use of that trope here in Pliny's letter. Now, the first thing to recognize is that the Acts of the Martyrs, whether it's that of Justin, Polycarp, Ignatius, Irenaeus, Perpetua and Felicity, Carpus and Papilus, the Skeleton Martyrs, the Gallican Martyrs, these are all literary fictions. They're fake. They have long been recognized as romances. They make heavy use of stereotypes. They often portray the hero as having a similar experience as the legendary characters from the Bible, and some of them are even arranged in a poetic structure. This was literature that was produced to inspire and entertain, and these books all depict the Roman officials as behaving very much like Pliny supposedly did here in 112 AD. Now, all of those books were written after the year 190, so either nothing had changed in those 8 decades between Pliny and the Acts of the Martyrs, and the Roman Empire was caught in a kind of a closed time loop like from a Philip K. Dick novel, or Pliny's letter was forged around the same time as the Acts of the Martyrs were being written, and that's why it appears to share so many of their set pieces. In the second apology by Justin Martyr from the 160s, the accused Christian Ptolemaeus is also asked twice by his accuser whether he's a Christian. In fact, in that book, they ask him the first time and then imprison him for a minute to give him the chance to think it over. And the centurion comes back and asks him again, and he still affirms it. The Roman judge says to the martyrs of Scilium, "Stop being of this persuasion." And later he says, "Stop being of this madness." And later he says, "Do you persevere in being a Christian?" And he finally says, "Do you want some time to consider the matter carefully?" He gave them 4 chances to repent. Each time they affirmed that they are Christians. The martyrdom of Polycarp, the Roman officials tell the accused, "What harm is there in saying that Caesar is Lord and in sacrificing and thereby making sure of your safety?" And then it says, Polycarp at first gave them no answer. And when they continued to urge him, he said, "I won't do as you advise me." I won't belabor the point here. This stuff is all over the martyria of the 190s and later, the Christian legends about the trials of their accused brethren. But we find it also faithfully represented here in Pliny's letter, which is supposed to date from 80 years prior. Moving on. And now Pliny gets a 3rd red card for intertextuality. He's finding himself in a world of shit. And it's because he says that for the confessing Christians who are Roman citizens, he signed an order for them to be transferred to Rome. Now, Roman citizens had a special right called provocatio by which they could appeal a capital sentence to the emperor. There were, in fact, many avenues of appeal available to Roman citizens, but the appeal to the emperor was most often used for capital crimes. Now, the sources on the actual procedures for this are fairly lacking. What I mean is, this rite was set in stone by what was called the jus provocationis, but we don't really get to see much of its practical application, like how it was done logistically. In fact, one of the main sources that's usually cited to give some perspective on how appeal to the emperor worked is the story of Paul in Acts of the Apostles. He waits until he's almost under the knife before it occurs to him to let his jailers know that he's a Roman citizen, and from that point onward in Acts, we are treated to the endless saga of him making his way to Rome under guard to ultimately appeal his sentence. Now, I appreciate the fact that not a lot of early Roman documents talk about the practical side of this legal stuff, like this appeals process, for example, but Acts of the Apostles should not be being used as a source for anything. It's potentially a source of warmth in a violent winter storm, but that's about it. Now, what commentators usually say here at this point is that Pliny is condemning these Roman citizens, but he pretty much expects them to exercise their right to appeal, so therefore he immediately books them on the next flight to Rome. But I draw your attention to another of Pliny's letters from Book 10, that is letter 56, in which he tells Trajan about a man who'd been banished, but didn't actually leave to go on his banishment. Like, he just went to work the next day like nothing happened. Now, 2 years later, the guy is saying that because the governor who banished him had been recalled, his banishment should be overturned, the banishment that he decided not to participate in. Well, Trajan is piping hot when he reads about this. He says, he had 2 years in which he could have asked for a retrial if he thought his sentence was unjust, but he took no steps to do so. So Trajan is very interested to take this case, while he asks Pliny to keep the man in custody until such time as he can have him sent to Trajan to try the case. And make no mistake, the case that Trajan would be hearing would be his appeal. And so this poor schmuck has to go to where Trajan is actually located, which was not necessarily in Rome. I mean, it could have been at Rome, but we also know that Trajan was kind of a rambling man. He obviously spent time in Dacia for the wars there, spent time in the East. The point is, for the emperor to try an appeals case, the appellant has to go to where the emperor actually is. I mean, I think that much is clear. In letter 74, Pliny tells Trajan about another guy who I would actually really like to learn more about, a guy who sounds like a typical 2nd century confidence man. He escaped from his employers and then spun some yarn about how he was originally a slave, but was captured by the Dacians, but they sent him as a gift to the Parthians, but he escaped them, but managed to steal some of their treasure before fleeing to Bithynia. Well, his appeal of his case against his employers has to be heard before Trajan too. And what does Pliny say? But I thought that I should send him on to you, i.e., he is sending him to Trajan's physical location. What happened here was that the forger needed there to be Roman citizens among the condemned to show how popular Christianity was even among the citizenry, but he recognized that a Roman citizen had certain rights. And in his copy of Acts of the Apostles, in his copy of the Letters of Ignatius, he saw that in the Christian tradition, condemned Christians who were Roman citizens made their way to the metropolis of the world, the mistress and queen of the earth, the city of Rome, to litigate their trial on the grandest stage of all. And it's of course implied that like Paul, like Peter, like Ignatius, like Justin the martyr, these poor fools condemned by Pliny will also gloriously die the martyr's death in that same city of Rome, so closely associated in the martyrdom literature with the fate of the condemned. This journey to Rome is portrayed in the literature almost as a kind of a reverse pilgrimage for the condemned Christian of the late 100s AD and early 200s. In possibly the most famous Christian story outside the New Testament, Peter is leaving the city of Rome, said to be on the Appian Way, and he passes by Jesus, of all people, and he asks Jesus, "Where are you going?" And Jesus says that he's going to Rome to be crucified again. And Peter gets the message right away and heads back to Rome to get the shit killed out of him. A martyr's death in Rome had symbolic significance for the Christians of the late 2nd century, the same time in which the Pliny letter was forged. Now, as it turns out, death was not actually the sentence that was supposed to be carried out on a Roman citizen who joined an illegal religion or illegal cult. The penalty for that was supposed to be banishment. So here we see another example in Pliny's letter among many where he is shown to be an innovator. He's the first to use the term Christian, the first to fully distinguish Christians from Jews, the first and only Roman to refer to Christians dying for the name. the first to enforce a capital crime against Roman citizens for joining an illegal cult, and as we'll see later, he's the first to come up with a way to test whether someone's really a Christian. Well, we could view Pliny as a kind of genius innovator, but it seems much more likely to me that all these conventions are being shoehorned in here because the letter was forged by a Christian in the late 2nd century, when all of these things where Pliny appears to be innovating were actually just part of the common conventions of the time in that much later period. Moving on. Pliny receives a red card now for low-key Christian propaganda when he says, "Those who are really Christians, it is said, would never offer wine and incense to an image of the emperor and statues of the gods." We also find Pliny to be guilty of weasel words when he uses the phrase, "it is said." Said by whom, exactly? I thought this cat didn't know anything about Christians. So Pliny not only applies weasel words, but also a classic no true Scotsman argument here, one which is very common in the apologetic writings from the late 2nd century to the effect that no true Christian would ever deny Christ. Here's what Justin Martyr has to say on that topic in the 160s, his second apology, quote, "When at last the man came to Urbicus, he was asked this one question only, whether he was a Christian. And being conscious of his duty and the nobility of it through the teaching of Christ, he confessed his discipleship in the divine virtue. For he who denies anything, either denies it because he condemns the thing itself, or he shrinks from confession because he's conscious of his own unworthiness or alienation from it, neither of which cases is that of the true Christian." End quote. As a thought exercise, imagine if, instead of Christians, Pliny was persecuting adherents of the cult of the Great Mother, that is Cybele. Would it not be somewhat out of place in that setting for Pliny to say something like, "I made them curse the Great Mother," which none of their adherents, it is said, can be forced to do? It's like, duh. That's implied by the very nature of their being adherents. But this line about no true Christian would ever curse Christ seems like a sectarian formula. And that's not even conjecture, because Justin, as we saw, and also Tertullian and Clement and others, not to mention Paul in 1 Corinthians, all deploy it in their writings. Back after this. Another red card for that ass. Peculiarities of style. Pliny said, "Those who denied their faith sacrificed to the gods and cursed Christ." Dude, who's Christ? This is another instance of him throwing terms out there where it's second nature for us to assume that Trajan is automatically going to know what he's talking about. But Trajan does not have access to Wikipedia. Like, what is he expected to have? An encyclopedic knowledge of every sectarian band and arcane cult in the Roman Empire? Added to which, as we discussed last time, the word Christian is constructed in such a way as to imply that it's a faction centered on or dedicated to an individual called Christ. So, in this context, it would be even more necessary to explain and clarify the term, as indeed the forger of the fake Tacitus passage would do. Like if I'm Trajan and Pliny's writing to me and he says, "I've been handling trials of Catalinians. One of the things I found is that no true Catalinian would ever curse Catiline," and I'd be like, whoa, back up. Who the fuck's Catiline? I mean, is this some kind of rabble rouser? Is he alive? Is he at large? I mean, he's got this giant faction supporting him, which you're representing as this colossal threat to my empire. It seems like you should be devoting a paragraph or two to what you're accomplishing on that front. But the forger, of course, is writing in the 180s, 190s. It doesn't occur to him that someone at this early date wouldn't know what Christ is. The forger has read the books by Justin. He's read some other apologetic works of the time. He's maybe read some early Acts of the Martyrs, like the Acts of Paul and Thecla. He knows that the Romans persecute Christians for the name of Christ. Therefore, Pliny throws out the term Christ with no explanation. Now, notice that Pliny never uses the term Jesus. I think that since the forger is assuming a scenario in which all manner of Christians are being caught up in this persecution, he's opting to use the unobjectionable El Generico term for the Christian deity, Christ, because the word Jesus had its own implications depending on what sect you were dealing with. There were some, like the followers of Cerinthus and Valentinus, and also the Ebionites, who categorically distinguished between Jesus and Christ. But one thing all Christian groups would agree on is that Christ was a divine figure of some kind. Jesus, not always. There were some heretics who thought of Jesus as a mere man, and Christ was a kind of spirit that entered into him. Now, I saw an interesting theory from the radical critic J. Raskin. He pointed out that there was a man who lived in Bithynia during the 70s AD named Gaius Cassius Christos, and he says that this man was the archpriest in charge of teaching the Bithynians to worship in the Roman style. Now, we'll get into it more later in the series, but Bithynia was one of the many places in the empire that had its own unique culture. Obviously, they were annexed by the Romans, and they at least initially preserved a lot of their own traditions and even laws. But Raskin's theory was that the Christians in this letter were actually partisan followers of this man Gaius Christos, who continued to honor and exalt him even after his death. And incidentally, Raskin also says that that's why, as we'll see later in the reading, why some of the Christians claim that they stopped being Christians 25 years earlier. And that would have been shortly after the death of this man Gaius Christos. Well, I don't hold to this theory, but I mention it just as a curiosity and for the purposes of being complete. I mean, for one thing, a theory like that doesn't take the persecution trope into account. It assumes that the Romans would just treat any sectarian group that they hated in this same way as they're allegedly treating the Christians. And as I've been saying repeatedly in this series, this type of treatment only makes sense when coming from the pen of a Christian. There are some who've tried to say that, well, the Romans treated the Bacchantes this way, the Magi, the Druids, the Isis cult, but those groups were proscribed in much earlier times for specific reasons, and there were specific procedures applied to going after them, whereas in the Christian persecution stories, it always seems like we're in the Wild West with Will Smith and Kevin Kline, and it's like the town sheriff taking the law into his own hands against the Christians. It's fashionable in our time to say that, well, the Romans prosecuted the Christians on a case basis through what was called cognitio extra ordinem, or coercitio, and these were just like their general powers to enforce law. And it's like that kind of argument has diminishing returns, because how many local magistrates can put Christians on trial under an extraordinary application of the laws until the Roman Empire as a whole finally decides to codify something in writing, which we don't actually see happening until the end of the 3rd century when it comes to the Roman persecution of Christians, and that was motivated entirely by political reasons. And by the way, speaking of the persecution trope, we deliver yet another red card to Pliny on these grounds, this time for the sacrifice test that he comes up with here as a way of getting the deniers to prove that they're not really Christians. Now, I'm calling it a sacrifice test, but strictly speaking, the Christians here are not being required to sacrifice. They have to invoke the gods and offer wine and incense to Trajan's image. Now, like I said before, Pliny the Younger is a true innovator. He is the first person in history to ever come up with the idea to get Christians to sacrifice and to curse Christ as a means to demonstrate that they deny their faith. And this passage in the letter is one of the stumbling blocks for theologians, because it's like, where did Pliny get this idea from? Did he just come up with it on the spot? Even Saint Candida herself, Candida Moss, is impressed with Pliny here for somehow recognizing that this test would be effective in getting the Christians to deny their faith. So Pliny is really innovative here, really impressive. A reading from 2 Maccabees. Eleazar, one of the scribes in high position, a man now advanced in age and of noble presence, was being forced to open his mouth to eat swine's flesh. But he, welcoming death with honor rather than life with pollution, went up to the rack of his own accord, spitting out the flesh, as all should do who have the courage to refuse things that it's not right to taste, even for the natural love of life. A reading now from 3 Maccabees. Speaking of the actions against the Jews by Ptolemy IV Philopator, quote, he proposed to inflict public disgrace upon the Jewish community, and he set up a stone on the tower in the courtyard with this inscription: none of those who do not sacrifice shall enter their sanctuaries, and all Jews shall be subjected to a registration involving poll tax. Those who object to this are to be taken by force and put to death. End quote. And a reading now from 4 Maccabees. The tyrant Antiochus, sitting in state with his counselors in a certain high place, and with his armed soldiers standing around him, ordered the guards to seize each and every Hebrew, and to compel them to eat pork and food sacrificed to idols. If any were found not willing to eat defiling food, they were to be broken on the wheel and killed." End quote. And we could have gone on to 100th Maccabees if we needed to. In these examples from books written from the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD, we find that one of the elements of persecution of Jews in the eastern cities was compelling them to sacrifice or to eat meat sacrificed to idols or to otherwise participate in the state worship. In 2nd Maccabees, they're compelled to worship the god Zeus, friend of strangers. In 3rd Maccabees, they actually give them a signing bonus for joining the Eleusinian mysteries, like refer a friend and you get an extra Alexandrian citizenship, void where prohibited. Well, either Pliny is indeed an innovative genius in coming up with this mini sacrifice test, or he is at least shown to be an expert on the sacred text of Judaism and Christianity, such as these Maccabees books. So, red card for persecution trope, red card for intertextuality. Now, Christians being forced to swear by the genius of the emperor, or the spirit of the emperor, or otherwise sacrifice to the Roman gods, as if I even had to tell you, all over the Acts of the Martyrs from the late 100s and from the 200s, and around the same time period that I'm saying that this letter was forged. In the Acts of the Skeleton Martyrs, the Roman judge says, "If you're going to say bad things about our sacred rituals, I won't listen to you. Instead, swear by the birth spirit of our Lord the Emperor." The martyrdom of Justin, quote, "In the time of the lawless partisans of idolatry, wicked decrees were passed against the godly Christians in town and country to force them to offer libations to vain idols." And that's exactly what Pliny's letter had them doing, offering libations. Again, from the same martyrdom of Justin, quote, "The prefect said, 'Offer sacrifice with one accord to the gods.' Justin said, 'No right-thinking person falls away from piety to impiety.' The prefect said, 'Unless you obey, you shall be mercilessly punished.' Justin said, 'Do what you will, for we're Christians and don't sacrifice to idols.'" The martyrdom of Ignatius, quote, "Trajan in the 9th year of his reign compelled all who were living godly lives to either sacrifice or die." End quote. By the way, the 9th year of Trajan's reign would have been 107 AD, which is before the Pliny letter. Hence, either this martyrdom is faked, or the Pliny letter is fake, or both. The martyrdom of Perpetua, it's written partially in the first person, quote, "The procurator said, 'Spare the gray hairs of your father, spare the infancy of your boy, offer sacrifice for the well-being of the emperors.' And I replied, 'I won't do so.' The procurator said, 'Are you a Christian?' And I replied, 'I am a Christian.'" In the same book, the proconsul tells one of the Christians to swear by the fortune of Caesar, just as in Pliny's letter. The Acts of the Gallican Martyrs, quote, "The authorities tried to force Blandina and Ponticus to swear by the heathen idols, but they steadfastly refused." And lastly, the martyrdom of Polycarp. The proconsul gives him 4 chances to repent, just as Pliny gave the Christians 3 chances to repent, and he says, "Swear by the fortune of Caesar and repent." In fact, the proconsul in the martyrdom of Polycarp asks Polycarp to repent so many times that Polycarp essentially ends up having to order his own execution. But these are all literary products from the late 2nd, early 3rd, mid-3rd century. Now, as with the examples that we saw in the Acts of the Martyrs earlier that depicted their interrogation and their stoicism, some might say, well, Pliny is forcing the Christians to sacrifice. He's putting the question to them and they're being silent. And that's something that also shows up in that Acts literature, but that's because it all really happened. But as I said, we are dealing here with literature. The Acts of the Martyrs are not the YouTube videos of the martyrs. And these literary devices that are found in these books from the 190s, the 200s, the 210s, are lining up perfectly with this Pliny letter, which I'm maintaining was forged at exactly this same time period. It is far more likely that these are all literary products of the same period that are borrowing from one another than that Pliny's procedure in a trial against Christians was almost a facsimile copy of the same type of trials that would be happening 100 years after his time, especially when Pliny seems to know all the elements of a typical trial of heroic Christian martyrs, despite not even supposedly knowing much about Christians. And again, we are being asked to believe that Pliny developed these procedures apparently all by himself, through his own stumbling and bumbling, yet we see them reflected faithfully a century after him. Speaking of literary borrowing, we close for today with yet another red card for intertextuality. Pliny tells us that it is said that none who are really Christians can be forced to curse Christ. We covered this earlier under low-key Christian propaganda, but there's more than one problem with it. I mentioned at the beginning of episode 11 that this appears to be a reference to Paul's letter, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 3. I want you to understand that no one speaking by the Spirit of God says Jesus is accursed, or Jesus is anathema. That passage in Paul's letters was actually interpolated by a Catholic editor. He stuck it before Paul's discussion of spiritual gifts. We'll get to that in the 1 Corinthians series. I mean, this is a clear-ass reference to 1 Corinthians here in Pliny's letter, and don't take my word for it. We'll close out today's discussion with an ancient letter that I personally found when I took an archaeological expedition of my own to northern Turkey, one of the few countries now with limited travel restrictions. It's a lost letter of Paul to Pliny the Younger, demanding him to cease and desist. Quote, Paul, an apostle known from God and known by God and known to man and known through man and in man, to the idiot, no-count, crumb-bum, plagiarizing shitbird Pliny the Younger. When I opened my mail today after I came back from a big anti-mask rally in Miletos, my brothers, I found a letter from my attorney advising me that you had plagiarized part of my letter. Now, I don't read pagan literature. In fact, I only subscribe to Jane's Defense Weekly, and I don't want you to be unaware, brothers, that I read that publication only in order to learn about such weapons as the godless state might be planning to use against us in order to seek out and destroy the freedom that we have in Christ Jesus. But whether or not they plan to use such weapons, it makes no difference to me, brothers, who am equipped with 4 AR-15s with appropriate anime decals. For as it says in Ezekiel, I allow you cow's dung in place of human excrement. Bake your bread on that. Now, to any Roman official who might have illegally opened this letter, was I threatening the legitimate government with what I said in my previous sentence about owning 4 assault rifles? Absolutely not. Because, technically, my brothers, I did not display the required intent, nor, as God is my witness, did I specify any planned and substantial act. But such things don't matter to me, because you and your so-called terrorist watch list will all be consumed by fire when the Son of God descends on a cloud from heaven with his saints. I'm not threatening you with fire there. I'm saying that the Son of God is going to threaten you with fire. Now, dear Pliny, for this reason I'm sending you Timothy, who is my apostle in all such matters, and he will come bearing a cease and desist letter in his right hand and a deer horn knife in his left, should he require it. I have wronged no one, I have condemned no one, except you. I condemn you for plagiarizing 1 Corinthians, for in everything you demonstrated yourself to be guilty in the matter. The sign of my hand of Paul. See what large letters I've written to you with my own hand. Note, too, my sketch of a middle finger. Be assured, dear brother, that it's aimed directly at you. So we have here an undisputed epistle of Paul tagging Pliny the Younger as a plagiarist, and as we know, eyewitness testimony can never be gainsaid. Today, we continued our close reading and deployed our red cards in arguing against the authenticity of Pliny's letter. In so doing, we are making the case that the letter is a late 2nd century Christian forgery and therefore doesn't conflict with a late origin for Christianity. We continue our close reading of Pliny's letter in the next episode, always keeping our key slogan in mind: it's not impossible that this thing is a fake. In the name of Saint Candida, we declare this text to be late and spurious. Thank you for listening. This criticism is ended. Go in peace.
what other stories of mythology do you think of as historical reality?